Hello, and welcome to Varn Blog. Today, I'm going to be responding to an article that I actually agree with a lot of by Freddie deBoer at his Substack. The article's name is pretty self-descriptively, "What People Want from Our Schools Has Never Been Accomplished Anywhere Ever." And he starts off by pointing out, I think accurately, that while there are real crises in literacy and in general education that I've been talking about, they're very real. They aren't instructional crises. There's no time period that we have with strong universal education where there are lots and lots of strong gains in the secondary schools. We've seen a lot of gains in education in primary schools, although that has stalled out. And for those of you who don't know the difference, in America, what we call primary schools would be between kindergarten and fourth or fifth grade. And then secondary schools are what we call middle school and high school. When I was in Mexico, we called them secundaria and preparatoria because mandatory education actually ended at ninth grade. If you look at the way the International Baccalaureate program, and I used to teach at schools that used it, broke this up. You had the middle years program, which was secondary, and then only 11th and 12th was the diploma program. Now, I bring this up because when we talk about education in America, we're often going back and forth between college and high school and primary school. And we go back and forth between education as a quality maker, education as a civic institution, and education as a primary provider of literacy. Now, I'm going to do several videos, not just in this response to Freddie here, about educational issues and literacy decline, as well as some stuff about numeracy problems and numeracy decline. That some of them are going to complicate the narrative that Freddie presents. I'm just going to put that out there, and I'm even going to bring some of that up today. But I've been a teacher for almost 20 years. I have a master's degree in education. I have coursework and a PhD in education. One day I might finally finish it off and get the DR in front of my name and become a dreaded administrator instead of just a classroom teacher and department head. I have done educational research for over 10 years. I don't usually tie it into my show directly. I've talked about things like critical reviews and meta-analysis and the problems with some of the meta-analysis I haven't really gone into a ton of. I've talked about the shitty nature of a lot of educational research because it is necessarily limited by legal limits in most countries. It's based on testing that is not necessarily ever dealt with for its validity because its validity is actually a business secret. I'm not joking. For the things produced by the College Board or Pearson or Princeton Review or any of that stuff. So we usually just have to go on generalizability, which is the results are consistent across sectors. There's some hard things that I want to tell you that you're not probably going to like about universal education, but then I'm also going to complicate some of the stuff Freddie says here. I don't think we are seeing a massive decline in education from instruction until very recently. I think there is indications that an overuse of technology, encouraged by administrators and downstream of funding and grants and the use of money, actually is doing some educational damage in the way that technology is being deployed. It is predating LLM-based AI, by the way. There's also large indications that the literacy problems, both in media literacy and in written literacy, are due to things that have consequences that that are beyond the scope of the school, and that we can improve them mildly by things like cell phone limits, et cetera, limiting distractions, but that the entire social apparatus which supports the school is actually more important. There's also some things that I think we're going to have to deal with, which is the heritability of certain aspects of intelligence and schooling. But I'm going to point out that I don't think the evidence is as strong as Freddie deBoer thinks they are on a few key points. And I will get to that when we get to some of his arguments around that. I also think Freddie's narrative is mostly accurate on the history of schooling and what it was for, but I do think it's a little bit oversimplified and a little bit too American. It literally tends to jump from ancient Roman and Greek ideas to Horace Mann and the American education system without putting it in its international context, both with Prussia and the UK, and what prompted modern standardized schooling beyond like Horace Mann's movement. Now, Freddie has a PhD and feels related about this and has written a book about it from 2000 called The Cult of Smart. I actually like the book. I think you should read it. People know Freddie's been a person on the show multiple times. I've known Freddie before he was famous. I knew Freddie before he had the breakdown that caused him to leave social media around some debate with Malcolm Harris. So I am sympathetic to Freddie, and I think he has a lot of good points. I also think he's a good writer. At least he's a clear writer, with some things to say. Okay, I'm going to read a paragraph though from this essay. That I think will help you. And I will link this essay in the show notes. Freddie says, the notion of academic life of school and then college and professional class life can be universalized as profoundly new. And the idea that schooling can be close social, economic, and racial gaps is new too. Asterisk. Not entirely new because they did some of this in the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was actually way more successful at it than the United States. But even there, it was not based on a universal generic notion of equity. And I know that surprises people, given all this stuff that, we talk about with the Soviet Union's view of equality, and so, valuing of workers, skilling the workers with professional class skills in the collectivist period of communist China, particularly in the 1960s and 70s. I've talked a lot about that. So no, it's not unique to America, and no, it's not a solely post-Brown versus Board of Education phenomenon outside of the United States. But Freddie's right that it mostly is a phenomenon that was only half-heartedly believed in America. And the initial impetus was for universal basic skills, basically based off of first the Puritan model that everyone needed basic literacy to be able to strive for God because you needed to be able to read to understand the Bible. But we were just talking about basic literacy. You needed to know how to read. And then you needed to know the basics to be able to do things in the world yourselves. It was very egalitarian, but it was not egalitarian in the way modern schooling is. And then you have this Prussian model that emerged in competition with the British model, actually, as part of the unification and national consolidation of what became the German nation. And it led to a schooling system that the American university and high school system is a hybrid of the English and Prussian models. That's why we have different things. We don't have A levels and stuff like that. And we're very different than the modern German education too, because Germany is very big on tracking vocational education, making sure there's good jobs and good training for vocational students. We have in my lifetime moved away from vocational tech, although we are going back to it. We call it what you'll call it career education, which is even more misleading. But one of the things is we have our career education set by industry pretty much directly and not just by social needs, and that there's a sense in which that is being used to actually undercut specific fields by trends in vocational or career education, or what we call it here, career and technical education, so CE or CTE. We used to call it VE. The focus of which is often disastrously specific to a very specific niche in time. And I say disastrously because some of this technical stuff, even outside of university, is highly specific and also physically demanding in ways that you can, 1/8 of blue collar working class men, for example, don't work. A lot of them are on disability because they just can't work anymore. There's other things that do that too. But I think we have to deal with those shifts because there was a way in which the American educational mission, there's been two ways in which the United States, after the failure of Lyndon Johnson's presidency in specific, if you think about the Great Society programs, that the United States has tried to deal with its economic uneven development internally. One is using the schools as a social center and social hub for things like nutrition and whatnot. Actually taking away those powers, like community school lunch programs like that were promoted by the Black Panthers, for example, and putting them in the hands of the state for good and ill. And since they're at the capricious nature of legislatures trying to make highly politicized points with increasingly no other social inputs other than those points going into it, it gets highly unstable. I can tell you all about it here in the way that we change laws on fee waivers and free and reduced lunch beyond the federal minimums. That can be a little bit shocking. So I want to talk about this in a couple of ways. I also want to talk about, I don't want to hear comparisons between elite private schools and public schools because elite private schools are elite. They only accept people who are very, very good. Now, good instruction happens at those schools. They hire good people. Part of the way they can hire good people, because a lot of the schools don't pay very well. I've worked in private schools. I can tell you about it. Is that it's an easier job because of the nature of the students that they have. It is not just the culture that those students set up. And then charter schools either tend to require an insane amount of additional work or very questionable influxes of money that are often scammy or outright illegal. And they also cream, although they're not allowed to cream in the same way that private schools are. So they do have to offer SPED programs and whatnot, but they don't have the same oversight or reporting requirements until they get in trouble in most states. Now, I tell you all this to tell you that it's just true that the United States has had a pretty uninspiring track record in regards to education. Freddie actually cites a article by David Drew from 2012, who points out that we've never done that well overall compared to the other industrialized nations until you broke us out by income sector. And then our elite students, even in the public schools, do as well or better than anybody. Our mediocre students do mediocrely at about the level of mediocre students in most countries, and our impoverished students do much less well. And it varies. I mean, we're particularly bad at math instruction, and we have been for a long time. We are below, the top countries in math instruction at the time of that article. In 1965 were England, Belgium, and France. Actually, today, England and France are much closer to the United States in scores. This is something that's also missed. The countries with the oldest public education systems coming out of bourgeois revolutions, with the exception of Germany, tend to be at about, just above the educational achievement of the United States. And if you look at the UK and France, this is actually abundantly clear. And the other thing that they tend to have are highly divisive social issues with poverty and ethnic tension. So you have low social trust instruction. Now, I know a lot of liberals and leftists are going to not be happy with me talking about this, because I don't think you need a homogeneous society to pull off a decent education system. I really don't. Countries with heterogeneous populations have pulled it off. See China, although we can talk about that too. There's also reasons that we have to doubt some of these comparisons, because they're based on PISA scores, which are manipulable, A, and B, like, you don't get clear indicators of like what works from PISA scores. Like Finland and the Republic of Korea, South Korea, usually are, neck and neck, and like in the top 5. Sometimes South Korea is number 1, sometimes Finland's number 2. But elites in Korea would try to send their kids to elite public schools in the United States and spend a lot of money to do it. And if you actually study the educational strategies and systems used between Finland and South Korea, there almost is no overlap between them. There's no magic bullet you can find. If you believe in Altaic language theory, which is out of vogue in Western countries, I don't know that I believe it, but there is some truth to it. But Finnish, and Korean share some superficial language structures that are very intuitive to native speakers and completely unintuitive to non-native speakers. And some people attribute the gains even to that. So I think it's interesting to look at this. Now, the other thing that we can look at is, and Freddie points this out, we are seeing drops in reading, math, and science today across all OECD countries. It is not just a US problem. Thus, ideas that you can just fix it with things that even have some proven efficacy behind them, like phonics. Like, oh, we need to teach phonics instead of sight reading. A debate, by the way, we have gone back and forth on 3 times in the last 100 years. Phonics became back in vogue when I was in school. It became out of vogue when I was a teacher. They were focusing on sight words and fluency. And by fluency, we don't mean necessarily comprehension and inferences. We're meaning the ability to read and make the word sounds very quickly. So between across the board, when I talk about like declines in literacy today, people think I'm often just talking about the United States. I'm not. I'm talking about the entire spectrum of education. So Freddie's right that the United States has done okay comparatively once you break out the relative demographics of every group. Although he also makes a lot of arguments about genetics that actually contradicts this fact. And I'll get to that later when I talk about some of the genetic issues that come up. Poor educational averages in this country, as Freddie says, and accurately, are and I've seen many people who study this talk about it, are mostly a distributional issue. The median American student does okay. They're okay. Top still students are the envy of the world, although that's less and less true. But there's truly terrible performing percentiles that drive policy and politics to a remarkable degree, because we really do believe we have to offer everyone the same education. In fact, after the revision of the law IDEA in the early 2000s, law I really believe in, actually, and I could go into parts of it that I do, but you have seen the lowest quartile drive most policy. And to the point that you will notice in a very real and substantive way that the way that administrators have decided to handle this is technology and graduation rates and schemes to increase the graduation rate. There are states that still put a lot of emphasis on standardized testing, but it's actually less than you think. Yes, there's standardized testing everywhere, but there's much less federal enforcement, aka none, actually, on a lot of this today. And the test scores can be deceptive because the tests themselves are being renormed and changed dramatically. In fact, I'll even talk about this in another video I'm making, where I talk about like comparing the ACT or SAT to just a version from 10 years ago is deceptive, because you see more and more comprehension questions on the ACT and SAT and less inference questions, because frankly, students just can't do them anymore. But again, this is across the entire OECD. And these declines relative to the past are in most quartiles of society, although the very elite, they're not there, and we can get into that later. So Freddie contends, 20 minutes in, this might be a long video, a warning, that the educational crisis is not all that real, at least as a function of schooling. I would disagree with him somewhat in very recent years, but I think in general he's correct. So why is there so much crisis talk? We can pull headlines about American educational failure going back all the way to the 80s and 90s. Actually, I can find them going all the way to the 1970s. And indeed, I've even had people like Marzano, who, if you have ever moved in educational things, is considered like a guru, particularly about 10 years ago in educational spaces, who admitted that we've seen little gains at all in educational efficacy, no matter what we did. Because we started complaining about the efficacy as soon as you actually achieved near universal access to high school. So in America today, and really for a long time, education has a contradictory goal. And like I said, we have used the school as a way to fix social problems in the United States, like student hunger or child hunger, and the way we've also used the military to deal with the uneven development between industrial and non-industrial areas by placing military bases in certain states that had very little income otherwise. See the Southeast. But the goal is impossible because the goal contradicts itself. And this shows up in minor contradictions in school. I have been told by educators since I started teaching in 2007 in high schools, and since I started studying to be an educator in 2005, and also as an adjunct professor and tutor before that. I've been involved in education for, a long, long time, that we needed to differentiate and standardize simultaneously. So we could no longer stagger our, despite the numbers, as an English teacher, I have, despite high numbers of like needing to grade 500 essays, I couldn't stagger when my students turned in those essays anymore between each section of the course, because I wanted to be able to move students in and out of every classroom at will. And that we needed to have standard assessments that was compliant with the graduation test and the college board test, so that we could handle this, but that we didn't track anymore, except that we differentiated internally to the classroom. So instead of tracking and trying to teach to a broad swath of each individual class that you may have, instead you are supposed to do personalized individual lesson plans for 200 students plus. In my modern teaching career in a public school, I've never had less than 180 students, and in my current capacity, I've had up to 400 at a time. You might go, what? Yeah, I have. So instead of tracking formally with a broad-based mission, because of problems around that, and I can talk about, there are some real problems around that, around cohorts, around spheres of proximity from Vygotsky and Soviet, models of learning around social learning. There are problems with this sort of tracking that are sincere and real, but there's also problems with saying just differentiate for each individual student, because there's no way you can really do that without over relying on technology, which until very recently was not capable of doing it anyway. And despite what I work in a hybrid school program. I'm not going to tell you which one, but it's a public school, and it's not a charter. And by hybrid school, we mean that like most of instruction is online, but we also offer instruction and direct tutoring one-on-one in person in the building. And that students who go to us can also go to in-person school, and most of our students do. We're a supplement through the public school traditional education for a lot of students, but for like certain students, we are their complete educational program, and we work with that. Now, I can tell you this, that I started studying online education in around 2010, and I was initially very optimistic, like a lot of fools. And I do think some of the turn against online education post-COVID is politically motivated. But I will tell you the efficacy of online education is actually quite low. And I say the efficacy is the completion of classes are quite low. Part of the reason why is the social learning component of an in-person building is removed. But another reason why is there just wasn't that much instruction. It was just giving students tasks and reading supplements and hoping without any interaction with them that would be enough. Kind of like correspondence courses in the 1960s plus, where you just sent people packets and they sent them back. The completion rate and passing rate of those kinds of programs is usually less than 50%. But equity in education and equity with the intent of achieving and education with the intent of achieving equality in all spheres, not equality of potential based on human difference, which is kind of what the Soviet model was based off, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, which they never really met, but nonetheless was a goal, is based off of the idea that there is human differences, and that this abstract equality, beyond equality of power and influence in your life, is always fake. It is always just equality before the law, or equality, bourgeois equity is usually bullshit, because you're not the same, right? You're just not. Now, I don't use this to talk about like natural hierarchy and lobsters, because I also think when we say people are not the same, it was more a valorization of the way in which people are different and useful to society and thus should have equal power. And the people who produce society should be able to control how their production is used, is a key, socialist construct. But the idea that they were going to make everybody the exact same, even through eugenics, frankly, was never that huge in early socialist movements, and it wasn't what Soviet education was based off of. Even in the collectivist period of China in the 1960s and 70s, where they Russificated the intellectuals, that was about evening out access to skills to those who need them, and also having intellectuals learn practical skills and not just be weird mandarins in cities. It was not the idea that everyone was going to do the exact same thing. Although there are some people in the PRC's more radical contingent that believe that. All right, so we can get back in. In ancient Athens and in ancient China, really, if we want to talk about this, schooling was really only available to free male citizens of means, meaning you had to own property, you couldn't be a slave, and you had to have citizenship in a polis. Even if you didn't have to have the citizenship in a polis, you had to find a tutor who would take you, and they would often only take you if they thought you were good enough to be taken. Plato in the Republic, as Freddie points out, talks about how different people have different educational needs because they have different roles, and rigorous intellectual training was only appropriate for the few who become philosopher kings. The medieval university was designed for an extremely narrow clerical and administrative elite, and as an offset from the elite, would often train non-noble people to come into it, orphans and whatnot. But even there, it was not out of a full notion of equity or equality. It was because you wanted to be able to boost up people from all strata and find the best in the fallen stratas, but make sure they didn't get too uppity by incorporating them to the discipline of the church, where they were still pretty much headed by people who had aristocratic privilege. 19th century public schooling was taking shape in America and Europe, but the state of goal elementary schooling was just functional literacy and basic numeracy. Because now workers needed to be literate and numerate to both vote and to read, but they weren't thinking of making everyone have the ability to be specialists. And if you were going to be specialists outside of law and clergy, you probably needed resources and a mentor, not a degree. The idea that all students should be educated to the same standard and evaluated against the same benchmark is actually explicitly contested, even when it emerged in the early 20th century. And it was kind of viewed as a Taylorization, and by that I mean Taylorism, the standardized of the factory, of the educational system. And you still get people pushing back about this, pretending like, oh, we're still in the factory model of education left over from Prussia, which we're not, actually. But people will learn a factoid like that and develop entire public policies and speaking careers out of it. So what are you going to do? When Horace Mann was pushing for common schools in the 1840s, he was arguing for the same universal basic education that was provided by Puritans in their small communities, but was not provided by the state. He was not arguing for universal college preparation because that wouldn't make any damn sense. The idea that every child would have been ready for higher education at a whim would have struck him as completely absurd. And I mean, it still strikes some modern school systems as completely absurd, frankly. So this idea that education brings equality beyond a basic literacy so that you can function as a worker is a new idea. It is in direct contradiction, just like standardization and differentiation are in direct contradiction with the idea that schools are sorters for access, which if you think that's gone away, you're a fool. All right. And in fact, what we've done is made most sorters for access that were suboptimal, racial bias and tests, been replaced with nothing except biases in income, either money or zip codes, getting people into colleges. So instead of acknowledging the problem, we've actually removed routes for people to get ahead. And when you combine that with AI today, it's actually quite dismal. So the idea that schooling was, for students to do beyond basic reading and math is a relatively new idea. And there was some basic cultural and civic goals, you might say propaganda goals, that came out of like the war projects between Germany and England that actually affected American schooling as a kind of basis of a civic religion that expanded that from just simple numeracy and literacy. It really truly wasn't where everyone's supposed to be able to be a scientist in any given moment or something like that. The idea that students were all capable of completing the same curriculum is completely new. The notion that schools can close social gaps rooted in race and class, or even bear primary responsibility for doing so, is even newer. Like I said, there was concerns with social equity in education, unlike the Soviet Union, but even there was no idea that everybody needed the same curriculum. You tested into what you were good at, and the idea is they were removing artificial barriers of income from the ability to test in. And that you succeeded socially. That's another thing that they did. We've always been focused on individual education for good and ill again. Now, I know that I sound like a crank and don't sound like a leftist right now at all, but I'm a believer in power egalitarianism. By that, I mean that people who contribute to society should be able to have a say in how it is run. And we do not now. I also believe that you do need standards of cultural literacy and stuff to talk about. Although the idea that you're going to have a cultural project that builds some kind of national identity that is static seems to me to be both foolish and a project of 19th century hubris. But we are in real educational decline, but I would say that's a social educational problem, not just a problem of schooling. All right. So the primary contradiction, to use some very Marxist and even Maoist language, in education is its filtering function versus equalization function. And we haven't got rid of either, but we've made it worse on both. Universal proficiency should be basic. We teach you enough that you know enough math and reading to teach yourself. And you may have media literacy and stuff we don't teach today, at least not to everyone, should be in part of that. I actually do believe that. But the idea that everyone's going to go off and be go to college, or we need universal college education, is absurd unless you're just trying to regulate the amount of people entering the workforce at a time, which in the height of the 20th century with baby booms and immigration probably made sense, as David Blacker writes in The Declining Rate of Learning. But it doesn't make sense now. We've spent trillions of dollars on administration and endless innovations, charter schools, high-tech testing, great curriculum, AI integrated testing, all kinds of stuff. There's literally no even meta-analysis data that it does a damn thing. In fact, the meta-analysis indicates that good direct instruction, good practical applicational use in scaffolding, and a good positive relationship with a teacher, as in you trust them, not just that you like them, that you trust them, is the only things that we see that make a difference on margin. Other things that make a difference that are more than marginal are how much do your parents spend reading to you? What leisure time do you see in your life? What are the standards of your home? These are social issues that cannot be fixed by a mere part of the social fabric. That part can help, but we can't fix it. Freddie is also right that the idea that more education builds a healthier economy is always based on the fact that somehow having more and more white-collar workers leads to more and more income, which good luck with that right now, as that's beginning to fall with AI. If everyone gets a college degree, the degree simply uses value as a credential sorter, which we've already seen. It doesn't make the educational parts less valuable, but guess what? You don't need to go to college to learn all the stuff. It is available to you now. Today, you really could teach yourself massive amounts of things on your own with relatively high fidelity. If you have someone who has some expertise sorting the wheat from the chaff for you, but that's not why you go to school. You go to school to network. You go to school to prove that you have the discipline of going to school, and you go to school to get a credentialization, just like people get licenses for professions, whether it's teaching or plumbing. We cannot solve a shortage of high-paying jobs just by giving people diplomas. Freddie is absolutely correct about this. And I think this has to be just dealt with. Honestly, and we have trouble dealing with things honestly today anyway. Now, I've gone on for 45 minutes, so I said I was going to do like 3 other videos on this issue because I want to talk about the declines of literacy. I want to talk about changes in higher ed policy and what higher ed policy may be good and bad for. And some of this is even going to sound a little different because I actually am going to advocate that, a fair amount of people should go to college. Because of the nature of the work that we have, and then if you're capable of it, you should probably do it. By capable, I also mean not going in the crippling amounts of debt for it. But I think we have to deal with a couple of things that are hard to look at face value. One, I think in the next episode I'm going to do on this, and we're going to be on this one a while because you can tell I really care about this. This is my day job. I want to talk about Freddie's assertions about genetics because I think there is evidence of some genetic components to intelligence, but the extent of those genetic components are complicated because we've never found the genes for them clearly. All right. And if you're going to say something, just like when we talk about when it was popular in the 90s and aughts to talk about sexuality as genetic, which I was always somewhat skeptical of since human sexuality rates vary from culture to culture and time period to time period. And indeed, the concept is actually somewhat modern. I was also, and that does not mean that I think that sexuality is a choice, by the way. I don't. I also think that saying it was genetic was problematic because we've never ever found a gene marker for it. We haven't. There does not seem to be one. With intelligence, this is more complicated because intelligence is more than one thing, which I know a lot of people will get mad at me for saying, but it is objectively more than just abstract reasoning. There are different kinds of intelligence. There aren't different kinds of learning styles. I know you've been told that. That's been debunked for 20 years, 30 years, actually, even more than that. It's been debunked since the 1990s, yet it's still taught in education all the time. I can go into the history of that in another video, but it won't be in this one on Freddie. But education, intelligence is a complicated phenomenon that we simplify in a word. And I also don't want to act like, for example, there are people who have low IQs who have skills that, like certain hunter gatherers or whatever, that we can't even fathom as, modern, relatively sedentary people. They're still human like we are. So I want to talk about this heritability thing very carefully, because I actually do want to complicate some of what Freddie pulls from here. I think he's a little bit too assured on some of this, and it even showed up in an interview I did with him very early on. But I do think that this era of optimism, whether it's charter schools or whatever, is ending, but we're replacing it with just throw everyone out of the system so it no longer serves its sorting function, which means that the sorting function's filled in by other things, like your zip code and your income level. Now, I'm going to talk about Freddie's solutions. I'm going to talk about some more specific things. I'm going to go into some rebuttals for him. This might be 3 episodes by itself. I'm not going to lie. I try to keep these Varnvog solos more succinct, but this is a big topic. But I think the key takeaway here is, one, there is a crisis of literacy. There's a crisis of skills right now. There's not a lot of evidence that prior to overuse of technology in the classroom that we actually had a crisis of instruction. 2, there's no evidence that America has ever done very well at educating its poor and disadvantaged children, period. There's debates over whether or not the disadvantages caused by intelligence are if the other way around, and I think it's a feedback loop, frankly. 3, I think it is just outright delusional to argue that we can fix all the social problems that affect children just in schools. I'm not saying we shouldn't do things like, meal programs and stuff from schools, but COVID actually showed the problem with over-relying on individual institutions for things that are socially necessary. Particularly when that individual institution wasn't built for that. And I think we're also going to have to talk about the sociality of learning and collective learning and not learning, because intelligence is many things, as I said, but it is social. Even in the ancient Greek world, part of what made a person a rational animal is that you could speak in the language of the society you lived in. And that speech proved your capacity for reason. This is true in Aristotle. I've talked about it in my Word is Politics series on Aristotle. So it's also actually kind of implied in Plato, although Plato thinks that everyone inherently already knows everything and you just have to remind them of it. Yeah, we won't get into Platonic epistemology. It's weird. But I do think we're going to have to talk about Freddie's solutions on a separate video, and then the more specific things about like the complications around heritability, genetics, etc. in another video. Because I'm not a bell curver, I'm more close to Stephen Jay Gould on this stuff. But the idea that there's no genetic component, and all this also seems to be bizarre. It'd be like claiming there's no genetic component in getting diabetes. It's a complicated. There's more than one gene, but at least there we know the gene markers, right? I think we have to deal with this in a really advanced way that doesn't just go, oh, it's just sociality or it's just biology, because the separation between biology and sociality is somewhat artificial itself. All right. I'll come back to this article in another video. So this is going to have a couple of parts because this is massive and I've only gotten through basically the biggest parts of Freddie's argument. I don't know. Maybe he'll see this and get a kick out of it. Who knows? But I will have some critiques, and then I want to talk about other areas where this is a problem. And after that, we're going to do a couple more videos on education and literacy and the problems that are documented and that I see, because I actually find a lot of the political problems that I have today are tied into literacy problems, as well as lack of understanding what politics is and is for on an institutional and state and class level, as opposed to as an expression of your own moral values, metaphysics, etc. Which actually tends to indicate that you don't really have that many moral values, metaphysics, etc., if you think it all can be subsumed in politics tote court. And on that note, I will come back to this in another video. Thank you for your support. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. I offer classes online. That's funny, given what I said about that. But I actually do believe that people can be benefited by free or cheap access to this education. I do not believe everyone will be benefited from it. And I don't mean that just, oh, the working class, I can't do it. Yes, I mean, I'm from the working class. My grandfather was a fucking bricklayer and he read Milton. All right, he had an 8th grade education. Don't give me that shit. You can't do it for other reasons. And it's hard for even educated people to do it now because they're using their brain in ways that actually are atrophying their brain. And a lot of people seem to kind of want it, but nonetheless, we need to talk about that. We need to talk about maybe what some viable, left and far left answers to this are, because I do sincerely believe that people who don't have the same skills as me can contribute to society as much as I can. You'll hear me talk about this in some interviews I'm doing on disability and other things, but they're not going to contribute in the same way. And we should quit lying to ourselves about that, both in school policy and in the way we talk to each other. Most of the people I know who claim to be egalitarian on this stuff are also horribly classist assholes. And I use classism here actually specifically because it's about access to habitats and how people think, not in like, oh, classism is the primary problem of class. No, I don't think so. I think classism is a specific sort of bigotry, but socialism is about something far larger than ending classism. Now, all that being said, I'm going to end today and we'll come back to Freddie's article in another video. Thank you. Protect your peace. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell. Leave a comment. I really do appreciate them, even when they're mean and I mock you back. If you mock me, I feel like it's fair to mock you. And if you have a criticism that's specific and like you tell me exactly what you have a problem with and you can cite where, I'm always down. I might disagree with you, but I'm usually open to hear from it. I'm open to hear from anything because even bad comments help me. Let's be honest. The algorithm doesn't really know. I mean, they could know, but it doesn't seem to care about whether or not the comments are positive or negative. I saw this in my shorts because it kept on like promoting me to people who left negative comments on purpose, but wouldn't go watch the main show. So why do the shorts? Because that's what it was doing. But anyway, take care, protect your peace, and know this. We can fight for a better tomorrow, but to do that, we kind of have to not lie to ourselves.